The airport buzzed with the usual mix of excitement and exhaustion. Travelers hustled through security lines, clutching passports and boarding passes, their faces painted with a mix of impatience and anticipation. Amid the crowd stood Captain Marcus Harris, a seasoned pilot with over 15 years of experience in the cockpit. His crisp uniform and calm demeanor exuded confidence. To most people passing by, he was just another traveler, but to those who knew him, Marcus was more than that. He was a trailblazer, one of the few black pilots to have climbed the ranks in the aviation industry. This was supposed to be a good day. Marcus had just completed a long-haul flight and was finally heading home to spend time with his family. As a perk of his position, he often enjoyed first-class seating on return trips, a small but cherished luxury after hours of intense concentration in the cockpit. Today, his airline had booked him a first-class ticket on another carrier, and Marcus looked forward to a smooth flight where, for once, he could sit back and relax instead of steering the plane. Approaching the gate, Marcus handed his boarding pass to the airline employee, a young woman who barely glanced up before scanning the ticket. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Harris," she said with a perfunctory smile. Marcus nodded politely, moving through the jet bridge. He was almost at his seat when a voice called out behind him. "Excuse me, sir. Can I see your ticket again?" Marcus turned, puzzled. A middle-aged man in a blazer, wearing a badge that marked him as part of the flight crew, approached him with a serious expression. Marcus handed over the boarding pass without hesitation, assuming it was a routine check, but the man's next words froze him in his tracks. "I'm sorry, but this ticket doesn't allow you to sit in first class." Marcus frowned. "That's a mistake. This is the seat assigned to me by the airline. I'm an employee." The man's gaze lingered for a moment before he spoke again, his tone clipped. "I understand, but this section is reserved for first-class passengers. You'll need to move to a seat in economy." Passengers nearby began to glance over, their curiosity piqued by the exchange. Marcus felt the weight of their stares, a familiar discomfort creeping into his chest. Taking a deep breath, he tried to keep his voice steady. "There's been some misunderstanding. I'm not just a passenger. I'm a pilot. This is a professional courtesy ticket." But the man didn't budge. "I'm following policy, sir. Please move to economy." The air seemed to thicken as Marcus stood there, caught between disbelief and a growing sense of indignation. He'd faced challenges before, from subtle dismissals to outright prejudice, but this felt different. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about respect, about dignity. As the seconds stretched on, the murmurs around him grew louder. Some passengers whispered, while others openly stared. A child in the aisle seat tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking, "Mom, why can't he sit there?" Marcus clenched his jaw, determined to keep his composure. He could feel the heat rising in his face, but he knew that losing his temper would only make things worse. Instead, he looked the man in the eye and said, "I'm not moving until you explain why I'm being singled out." The man shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if searching for backup. "I'm not singling you out, sir. This is simply protocol." But Marcus knew better. He could see it in the man's eyes, in the way his voice faltered, in the way he avoided answering the question directly. He knew this wasn't just about a ticket. Just then, another member of the flight crew appeared, her expression neutral but cautious. She whispered something to the man, who nodded reluctantly before turning back to Marcus. "Fine," he said curtly. "You can keep the seat, but I'll be filing a report." Marcus didn't respond. He slid into his assigned seat, his back straight and his hands gripping the armrests. The tension in the cabin was palpable, but he refused to let it show. He wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. As the plane taxied down the runway, Marcus stared out the window, his mind racing. He thought about all the times he'd been underestimated, about the countless barriers he'd broken through to get where he was. He thought about his family, about the example he wanted to set for his kids, about the countless others who looked up to him as a symbol of what was possible. But most of all, he thought about 3 words, 3 simple, powerful words that he would soon use to change everything. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as the flight lifted off the ground, climbing steadily into the sky. Marcus leaned back in his seat, staring out the window as the city below grew smaller. Despite the beautiful view, his mind was elsewhere, replaying the events from just moments ago. The encounter with the crew member wasn't sitting right with him. He'd faced similar moments before, moments where people seemed to question whether he belonged, but no matter how many times it happened, the sting was always the same. As a pilot, Marcus had dedicated his life to aviation. Flying wasn't just a job for him. It was a passion, a calling he felt since he was a boy. He remembered how his father used to take him to the local airfield on weekends, watching the planes take off and land. His dad would say, "One day, you'll be up there too." And Marcus believed him, even when others doubted. Growing up in a small southern town, Marcus learned early on that the road to success wouldn't be easy, especially for someone like him. He still remembered the way people looked at him when he first announced his dream of becoming a pilot. Some laughed, some tried to discourage him, and others simply dismissed him altogether. "That's not a career for someone like you," they'd say, as if his skin color automatically disqualified him. But Marcus didn't let their words stop him. He worked harder, studied longer, and refused to give up, even when the odds were stacked against him. He earned his pilot's license at 23, becoming one of the youngest black pilots in his training program. Over the years, he'd built a reputation for being reliable, skilled, and unshakable under pressure. He'd flown through turbulence, storms, and even emergencies, always keeping a cool head and a steady hand. Yet no matter how high he climbed, there were always moments like this, moments where he was reminded that, to some people, he still didn't belong. The thought made his stomach tighten as he shifted in his seat, trying to shake off the lingering frustration. The flight attendant approached, her smile polite but cautious, as though she could sense the tension still hanging in the air. "Can I get you something to drink, sir?" Marcus glanced up at her, forcing a small smile. "Just water, please." She nodded and returned a moment later with a small bottle and a cup of ice. "Let me know if you need anything else." He thanked her quietly, then turned his attention back to the window. Below him, the patchwork of fields and roads stretched endlessly, a reminder of how far he'd come, and how far he still had to go. As he sat there, his mind drifted to his family. His wife, Camille, had always been his biggest supporter. She'd been there through the long hours of training, the sleepless nights before exams, and the nerve-wracking moments of doubt. Camille never wavered in her belief that Marcus was destined for greatness. "You were born to do this," she would say, her voice steady and full of conviction. Their two kids, Jordan and Maya, idolized him. To them, he wasn't just dad, he was a hero, a living example of what hard work and determination could achieve. Marcus thought about the stories he often told them about his flights, how their eyes would light up with wonder as he described soaring above the clouds. It was those thoughts that kept him grounded, even in moments like this. He wasn't just living for himself, he was living for them, for the next generation, for the young black kids who needed to see that they could dream big too. The man sitting next to Marcus shifted, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Hey," the man said, his tone friendly. "Are you a pilot?" Marcus turned to him, surprised by the question. "Yeah, I am. How'd you guess?" The man chuckled. The uniform kind of gave it away. Marcus glanced down at his neatly pressed shirt and tie, the gold wings pinned to his chest. He supposed it was a dead giveaway. "Fair enough," he said with a faint smile. "I thought so," the man continued. "You've got that air about you, calm and collected. I'd always imagined pilots must have nerves of steel." Marcus shrugged. "Comes with the job, I guess. You learn to stay calm no matter what happens." The man nodded, then hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but it's really inspiring to see someone like you in that role. My son wants to be a pilot, and I think he'd really look up to you." Marcus felt a warmth spread through his chest, a reminder of why he did what he did. "What's his name?" he asked. "Ethan," the man said, pulling out his phone to show a picture of a smiling boy holding a toy airplane. Marcus studied the photo, his smile growing wider. "Tell Ethan to keep dreaming big. If he works hard and stays focused, he can do anything." The man's eyes softened with gratitude. "I'll tell him. Thank you." As the conversation faded, Marcus leaned back again, his thoughts returning to the flight crew member from earlier. The encounter still gnawed at him, not because of the inconvenience, but because of what it represented. How many times have others like him been quietly pushed aside, their qualifications questioned, their worth underestimated? He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails until he found what he was looking for, a message from his airline's diversity and inclusion team. They'd recently launched an initiative to address bias in the workplace, and Marcus had been asked to share his experiences. At the time, he'd hesitated, unsure if his voice would make a difference. But now, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He began drafting a message, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. He described the incident in detail, not with anger, but with a quiet determination to spark change. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about making sure no one else had to face the same kind of treatment. As the plane continued its journey, Marcus looked out at the endless sky, a sense of resolve settling over him. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't stay silent. He would use his voice, his platform, and his experience to make a difference, no matter how long it took. And those three words, simple, powerful, undeniable, were forming in his mind, ready to be spoken at the right moment. The soft glow of the cabin lights flickered as the flight cruised at 35,000 feet, a quiet hum settling over the passengers. Marcus stared at his phone, rereading the draft of his email. He'd written it with careful precision, outlining the incident without anger or blame, but his hands hovered over the send button. A part of him wondered if it would even make a difference. Would anyone care? Or would it just get lost in a sea of polite acknowledgments and empty promises? As the minutes passed, the incident replayed in his mind. He thought about the tone in the crew member's voice, the subtle condescension, the assumption that he couldn't possibly belong in first class. It wasn't the first time he'd faced something like this. Over the years, he'd grown used to the questioning looks when he walked through the airport in his uniform, the surprise on passengers' faces when they realized he was their pilot. It was always there, an undercurrent of disbelief, no matter how many flights he'd safely landed or how many hours he'd logged in the sky. He glanced around the cabin. A young woman across the aisle was typing on her laptop, headphones in her ears. A businessman a few rows ahead was flipping through a folder of documents, and just behind him, he could hear the soft gabbles of a child as her mother read her a story. It was a scene of quiet normalcy, yet Marcus felt the weight of the earlier confrontation pressing down on him. A reminder that even in spaces meant for rest and relaxation, he wasn't truly free from scrutiny. The flight attendant returned, her polite smile intact, but this time her eyes lingered a little longer. "Is everything okay, sir?" she asked, her tone softer now, as if she sensed the turmoil beneath his calm exterior. But he wasn't Marcus fine. nodded. Something "I'm about fine. this Thank moment you." felt heavier, more significant than all the others before it. Maybe it was because he was tired of letting these moments slide, tired of shrugging them off as just another example of the quiet biases he'd grown so accustomed to. Or maybe it was because he was starting to realize how much his silence could cost. Not just for him, but for the people who came after him. As he sipped his water, Marcus noticed a couple seated near the front of the cabin, whispering quietly to each other. The man had been watching him since the boarding incident, his expression a mixture of curiosity and something else Marcus couldn't quite place. Finally, the man stood, making his way toward Marcus's seat. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice low enough to avoid drawing attention. "I couldn't help but overhear what happened earlier. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry you had to go through that. It wasn't right." Marcus looked up, surprised. The man's sincerity was evident in his eyes, and Marcus felt a flicker of gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "It's something I've dealt with before." The man hesitated, then added, "I work in corporate leadership for an airline. Not this one, but another. And I've seen how situations like this can escalate. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know." Marcus nodded, his mind turning over the man's words. Was this a chance to push for real change? To take this moment and turn it into something bigger than himself? He didn't know yet, but the offer stayed with him long after the man returned to his seat. As the flight continued, Marcus found himself thinking about the countless other stories he'd heard from colleagues, pilots, flight attendants, and other professionals who had faced similar challenges. There was Jackson, a fellow pilot who'd once been mistaken for a baggage handler, despite his uniform and the ID badge hanging around his neck. And Danielle, a flight attendant who'd been told by a passenger that she didn't look like she belonged in the sky. These weren't isolated incidents, they were part of a larger pattern, one that Marcus was determined to challenge. He thought about his own journey, the sacrifices he'd made to get to this point. The nights spent studying when his friends were out having fun. The long hours of training, often feeling like he had to prove himself twice as much just to be seen as equal. The weight of being one of the few black faces in an industry still struggling with diversity. It hadn't been easy, but he pushed through because he believed in the power of representation. He believed in the importance of showing the next generation that they could dream big and achieve even bigger. But now, sitting in that first-class seat, Marcus wondered if it was enough. Was it enough to just exist in these spaces? Or did he need to do more, to speak up and challenge the biases that still lingered beneath the surface? The three words that had been forming in his mind earlier felt closer now, sharper, their weight pressing against him like a call to action. The plane began its descent, the captain's voice crackling over the intercom with the usual announcements. Marcus felt a shift in the cabin, passengers sitting up straighter, gathering their belongings, preparing for the journey's end. But for Marcus, this was just the beginning. He knew that the real work would start once he landed, once he stepped off the plane and faced the world waiting for him. As the wheels touched down on the runway, Marcus took a deep breath, a sense of resolve settling over him. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let this moment pass without doing something about it. The tension that had been building inside him wasn't just frustration, it was fuel, a driving force that would push him forward, no matter how difficult the path ahead might be. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began filing out of the plane. Marcus gathered his things, his movements deliberate and steady, as though grounding himself for what lay ahead. He could feel the eyes of the flight crew on him as he made his way toward the exit, but he didn't look back. Instead, he focused on the three words now burning in his mind, ready to be spoken when the time was right. And as he stepped into the terminal, the buzz of the airport enveloping him once again, Marcus knew that this was more than just another flight. It was the start of something bigger, a story that was far from over. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of arrivals and departures, announcements echoing over the loudspeakers, hurried footsteps, and the hum of conversations in countless languages. Marcus walked purposefully, his carry-on rolling behind him, his mind laser-focused on what needed to happen next. The encounter on the plane still lingered in his thoughts, not as a wound, but as a challenge. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who'd ever felt like they didn't belong in spaces they'd worked tirelessly to reach. He pulled out his phone and reopened the email draft he'd written during the flight. His thumb hovered over the send button once more, but he hesitated. Was this enough? Would one email really spark the change he was hoping for, or did he need to take a bigger step? The question swirled in his mind as he navigated through the terminal, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and determination. As Marcus reached the baggage claim area, a familiar voice called out his name. He turned to see Camille waving, her smile warm but tinged with concern. Jordan and Maya were by her side, their faces lighting up as they spotted him. Marcus's heart swelled as he dropped his bag and knelt down to hug them both. For a moment, the weight of everything lifted, replaced by the pure joy of being with his family. "Hey, you made it," Camille said, wrapping her arms around him. "How was the flight?" Marcus hesitated, unsure how much to share. "It was fine," he said, his tone measured. "I'll tell you more about it later." Camille studied him, her sharp intuition picking up on the unspoken tension. "Okay," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "Whenever you're ready." They loaded into the car, the kids chattering about their day as Marcus sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring out the window. He could feel Camille's occasional glances, her silent support a steady presence beside him. As they pulled into their driveway, Marcus felt a sense of calm wash over him. Home was his sanctuary, the place where he could be himself without judgment or expectation. That evening, after the kids were tucked into bed, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him. Camille joined him, a mug of tea in her hands. "So," she said gently, "are you going to tell me what's been on your mind?" Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. "Something happened on the flight," he began, recounting the incident in detail. As he spoke, Camille listened intently, her expression shifting from understanding to frustration to quiet determination. "That's not okay," she said firmly when he finished. "You've worked too hard to let something like this slide." "I know," Marcus said, his voice heavy. "But what do I do? Send an email? File a complaint? Will it even matter?" Camille placed a hand on his arm, her eyes steady. "It matters because your voice matters. You've always said you want to inspire change, Marcus. This is your chance to do that." Her words settled over him like a challenge, reigniting the fire he felt earlier. Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. He couldn't let this go. Not this time. The next morning, Marcus took the first step. He sent the email, addressing it not just to the diversity and inclusion team, but to senior leadership, outlining the incident and the broader implications it represented. But he didn't stop there. He reached out to a network of fellow pilots and industry professionals, sharing his experience and inviting them to join the conversation. To his surprise, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Messages poured in from colleagues who faced similar situations, their stories echoing his own. Some were angry, some were resigned, but all of them shared the same underlying frustration, the feeling of being overlooked, undervalued, and underestimated in an industry that was supposed to be built on teamwork and trust. Marcus realized he wasn't alone in this fight. He began organizing a virtual meeting, bringing together voices from across the industry to discuss actionable steps they could take to address bias and promote inclusivity. As the meeting date approached, Marcus felt a mix of anticipation and nerves. He knew the stakes were high, but he also knew they couldn't afford to stay silent any longer. On the day of the meeting, Marcus logged in early, his heart pounding as the participant count steadily climbed. Pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, and even a few corporate executives joined the call, their faces filling the screen. Marcus took a deep breath, his palms damp as he prepared to speak. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "We're here because we believe in this industry and the potential it has to bring people together. But we're also here because we know it's not perfect. Today, I want to talk about how we can work together to create real change, so that no one else has to feel like they don't belong." As Marcus spoke, he could see nods of agreement, hear murmurs of support. The energy in the room was palpable, a collective determination to address the unspoken truths that had lingered for too long. But just as the conversation was gaining momentum, a new message popped up in the chat, its tone cutting through the positive atmosphere like a blade. "Some people just can't handle the realities of the job. Maybe they're not cut out for it." The words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the resistance they were up against. Marcus felt his chest tighten, but he refused to let the comment derail him. Instead, he addressed it head-on, his voice firm but calm. "This isn't about anyone being cut out for the job," he said. "It's about ensuring that everyone who is qualified has an equal opportunity to succeed, and that they're treated with the respect they deserve. Dismissing these concerns doesn't make them go away. It just makes it harder for us to grow as an industry." The tension in the virtual room was almost tangible, but Marcus could see that his words had struck a chord. The comment was quickly drowned out by an outpouring of support, participants rallying around the shared goal of progress and inclusivity. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and challenging, filled with setbacks and resistance. Still, as the meeting came to a close, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change wasn't easy, but it was necessary, and he was ready to fight for it. That night, as Marcus sat on the porch with Camille, watching the stars blink against the dark sky, he felt a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't backing down. The story was far from over, and the most intense moments were still to come. The porch was quiet, the night air cool against Marcus's skin. He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the sky as Camille sat beside him. The events of the past few days swirled in his mind, a whirlwind of emotions, conversations, and decisions. The virtual meeting had been a success, but it also left him with a gnawing realization. Change was going to take more than just stories and good intentions. It needed action, bold and decisive, to break through the barriers that had stood for far too long. Camille broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "You know this isn't going to be easy, right? The meeting was a great start, but you're stepping into a fight that a lot of people aren't ready for." Marcus nodded. "I know, but I'm not doing this for myself. It's for all of us, for the people who've been overlooked, pushed aside, told to wait their turn while nothing changes. I can't let this go." She reached over, taking his hand in hers. "You're not alone in this. We're with you, every step of the way." Her words gave Marcus a sense of reassurance, but the lingering unease in his chest didn't fade. Something about the anonymous comment from the meeting stuck with him. It wasn't just the dismissiveness, it was the way it had been worded, sharp and deliberate, as if designed to cut deeper than the others. He couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't random, that whoever had typed it had a personal stake in silencing him. The next morning, as Marcus was scrolling through his email, a new message caught his attention. The subject line was vague, follow-up from yesterday, but the sender's name wasn't familiar. Curious, he opened it. The email was brief, almost cryptic. Asterisk Marcus, I was on the call yesterday. I think you're on the right track, but you need to be careful. Not everyone wants things to change, and some will do whatever it takes to keep things the way they are. Watch your back. Asterisk. Marcus's pulse quickened as he read the words. There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it, but the warning was clear. Someone wasn't just opposed to his efforts. They were actively working against him. He sat back, the weight of the message sinking in. Was this paranoia, or was there more going on beneath the surface than he'd realized? He spent the rest of the day trying to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept circling back to the email. The sender's anonymity made it impossible to know their intentions. Were they genuinely trying to help? Or was this another way to rattle him? Either way, it added another layer of tension to an already fraught situation. Later that evening, Marcus received a call from Jackson, the fellow pilot he'd mentioned during the meeting. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Jackson began, his tone serious. "And I wanted to share something with you. It might help you understand what you're up against." Intrigued, Marcus listened as Jackson recounted an experience he'd had years ago. After speaking out about racial disparities in the hiring process, Jackson had started noticing subtle but unmistakable changes. He was passed over for promotions he'd been told he was in line for. His flight assignments became less favorable, often leaving him away from home for long stretches. And when he tried to address it, he was met with excuses and deflection. "It's not always obvious," Jackson said. "But the pushback is real. They won't come at you directly. They'll chip away at you little by little, until you either back down or burn out." Marcus felt a chill run through him. Jackson's story mirrored his own fears, but it also fueled his determination. If they thought they could intimidate him into silence, they were wrong. He thanked Jackson for sharing and hung up, his mind racing with the implications. He couldn't ignore the warning signs, but he also couldn't let them derail his mission. A few days later, Marcus was scheduled for a flight out of Chicago. As he arrived at the airport, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't anything overt, just a sense of unease, like someone's eyes were on him even when he couldn't see them. He brushed it off, chalking it up to nerves, and focused on his pre-flight routine. But as he reviewed the flight plan, a new detail caught his attention. The co-pilot assigned to the flight was someone he'd never worked with before, a senior pilot named Captain Reynolds. Marcus had heard of him in passing, but their paths had never crossed. From what he gathered, Reynolds was known for his no-nonsense approach and a reputation for being, at best, indifferent to issues of diversity and inclusion. When Marcus introduced himself in the cockpit, Reynolds gave him a curt nod, his expression unreadable. The pre-flight preparations were professional but terse. with little conversation beyond what was necessary. Marcus couldn't tell if it was just Reynolds's personality or something more, but the tension between them was palpable. The flight itself started smoothly, the usual rhythm of takeoff and cruising settling into place. But midway through the journey, Marcus noticed Reynolds glancing at him, his gaze sharp and assessing. Finally, Reynolds broke the silence. "You've been making waves," he said, his tone neutral but laced with something Marcus couldn't quite place. Marcus kept his response measured. "I believe in standing up for what's right. It's not always easy, but it's important." Reynolds's lips twitched, almost forming a smirk. "Just be careful you don't bite off more than you can chew. This industry has a way of chewing people up and spitting them out." Marcus met his gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm aware of the risks, but I'm not here to play it safe. I'm here to make a difference." The rest of the flight passed in relative silence, but the tension lingered. By the time they landed, Marcus felt like he'd been through a battle of wills, though no words had been spoken outright. As he debriefed and prepared to leave the airport, he couldn't help but feel that Reynolds' warning wasn't just a casual remark. It was a glimpse into the resistance he was bound to face as he pushed forward. As Marcus stepped into the bustling terminal, his resolve solidified. The stakes were higher than he'd anticipated, and the obstacles were more complex. But he wasn't going to let fear or doubt hold him back. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it. He had come too far to turn back now, and the fight was only just beginning. The following week, Marcus found himself back in Chicago for a meeting with the airline's senior leadership team. After his email and the virtual discussion had gained traction, the company had reached out, inviting him to present his concerns and ideas directly to the decision-makers. It was an opportunity Marcus knew he couldn't pass up, even if the prospect of sitting across from the executives who had the power to make or break his career left him uneasy. As he walked into the sleek, glass-paneled boardroom, the weight of the moment hit him. Around the table sat a dozen men and women, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and guarded professionalism. At the head of the table was the CEO, a man known for his sharp business acumen but not for his warmth. Marcus took a deep breath and introduced himself, thanking them for the opportunity to speak. He began with his story, recounting the first-class incident, the biases he'd encountered throughout his career, and the countless stories shared with him by colleagues who'd experienced similar challenges. He spoke about the importance of inclusivity, not just as a moral imperative but as a business advantage, citing data and studies to back his points. As he spoke, he could see some of the executives nodding, while others remained expressionless, their pens tapping lightly against their notepads. When Marcus finished, the room was quiet for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then the CEO leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "Thank you for sharing, Captain Johnson," he said, his voice measured. "We've heard similar concerns in the past, but change is a complex process. What exactly do you propose we do?" Marcus had anticipated this question. He outlined a series of actionable steps: mandatory bias training for employees, a review of promotion and hiring practices, and the establishment of a task force to ensure accountability. As he spoke, he could feel the tension in the room shift. Some executives leaned in, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Just as he was finishing, one of the senior executives interrupted. "While these are admirable goals, Captain Johnson, we have to consider the realities of running an airline. Implementing these changes would require significant resources, and frankly, it's not clear if the return on investment justifies the expense." The words stung, but Marcus didn't falter. "With all due respect," he said, his voice steady, "the cost of inaction is far greater. When employees feel undervalued, it affects morale, productivity, and ultimately the customer experience. Investing in equity isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do." The CEO raised a hand, silencing further debate. "We'll take your proposals under advisement," he said. "Thank you for your time." The meeting ended, and Marcus left the room with mixed emotions. He had said everything he wanted to say, but the lack of immediate commitment from leadership left him wondering if it would be enough. As he walked through the lobby, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an anonymous sender with the subject line, asterisk, check this out, asterisk. Marcus hesitated, then opened the message. Attached was a PDF containing internal documents from the airline, emails between executives discussing ways to quietly downplay his concerns and avoid any significant changes. The language was blunt, even dismissive, with phrases like asterisk ride out the PR storm asterisk and asterisk limit his influence. Asterisk. His hands shook as he scrolled through the file. This wasn't just resistance, it was a deliberate attempt to undermine him. Whoever had sent this wanted him to know the uphill battle he was facing, but it also gave him a powerful weapon, proof. Marcus spent the next few days strategizing. He knew he couldn't go public with the documents without risking legal consequences, but he could use them to strengthen his position. He reached out to a trusted journalist he'd worked with in the past, sharing his story and the broader implications of the airline's resistance. The journalist agreed to investigate, promising to bring the truth to light in a way that would spark action without compromising Marcus's career. Days later, the article went live, detailing the challenges Marcus and others like him faced in the aviation industry. It was a measured piece, balancing personal stories with data and expert opinions, but it didn't shy away from calling out the systemic issues that needed to be addressed. The article gained traction quickly, drawing attention from media outlets, advocacy groups, and even some government agencies. As the pressure mounted, the airline's leadership could no longer ignore the issue. They announced a series of reforms, including the creation of a diversity and inclusion board and the implementation of new training programs. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start, a sign that progress was possible, even in the face of resistance. But just as Marcus began to feel a sense of relief, another twist emerged. He received a call from the anonymous email sender, who finally revealed their identity. It was Captain Reynolds. "I wanted to see if you were serious," Reynolds admitted, his tone less antagonistic than Marcus remembered. "You proved me wrong. I respect that." Marcus was stunned. The man who had seemed like an adversary had been quietly testing him all along, pushing him to see how far he was willing to go. "Why didn't you just come forward from the beginning?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Sometimes, people need to be tested to see if they're really ready for the fight," Reynolds said. "And you are. Keep going, Marcus." The call ended, leaving Marcus with a mix of emotions: anger, gratitude, and a renewed determination. The journey had been harder than he ever imagined, but he had found allies in the most unexpected places. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, Marcus felt like real change was within reach. As he sat down to draft his next steps, he realized that the most important battles were often the ones you didn't see coming, and he was ready for whatever came next.